Have you ever trusted someone gentle, only to realize they were slowly breaking you? You assume you can sense when someone is toxic, when an energy feels heavy, when a behavior quietly crosses the line of what feels acceptable. But what if that instinct is only tuned to the surface? What if the real dangers aren't loud or cruel or obvious at all? What if the most quietly destructive people are those who appear kind, soft-spoken, even beloved family members? And in your effort to shield yourself from the villains you can see, you might be unknowingly opening the door to something far more dangerous: the unconscious of others, slipping silently into your own. Carl Gustav Jung dedicated his life to studying these hidden dynamics. In his work, The Ego and the Unconscious, he reveals that what truly governs us does not lie in the realm of awareness. And this doesn't apply only to you, it applies to everyone. And that's exactly where the true danger begins. Because when someone lives blind to their own darkness, that darkness begins to look for a host. And often that host is you. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling emptied, even when nothing hurtful was said? Perhaps you've never stopped to examine why. But now think, how many times have you felt drained after speaking with someone? How many times have you been blamed for something you never did? Or placed in the role of a savior in a story that wasn't even yours? Jung called this projection, an unconscious process where someone casts onto you the parts of themselves they refuse to face. And from that moment on, you stop being a person in their eyes. You become a symbol, a mirror, an enemy, a fantasy. And none of these images, they are not you. And the most frightening part? Most of the time, you don't even know it's happening. You think you're being helpful. You think empathy is maturity, but deep down, a strange fatigue lingers. You begin to lose your shape. You're solving conflicts that aren't yours, absorbing storms you didn't create, being quietly reshaped by emotional currents you never asked to enter. And not all of it comes from malice. Jung warned, the greatest dangers don't come from conscious manipulators. They come from those who are utterly unconscious of themselves. People alienated from their own psyche, governed by masks, traumas, complexes, and repressed desires. They are not evil, but they are deeply dangerous. And that danger rarely arrives as threat. It arrives in silence. It doesn't knock. It seeps in, through small remarks, strange pauses, loaded silences. Until one day, you're no longer sure what's real inside you. And when that happens, you are no longer yourself. You are their shadow. Perhaps you're in it now, in a friendship, a relationship, a work dynamic, even within your own family. And perhaps you're quietly asking, what's wrong with me? And the answer is, nothing. But something is very wrong in the way your mind is being used to carry what is not yours. These emotional dynamics are not rare. They are everywhere. They move through people not with malice, but with inherited confusion. And the most dangerous part of it all is this: unless seen clearly, these patterns continue. They embed, they consume, and sometimes, what we fear in others also lives in us. After this, nothing will look the same again. Maybe not even you. Stay close. Share where you're listening from. And if this stirred something in you, subscribe. Thank you for your support. Imagine living with someone who blames you for everything they feel, who turns your presence into a trigger, who makes you feel responsible for emotions you never caused. At first, they appear fragile, sensitive, even deep, but slowly you begin to realize something else is happening beneath the surface. Over time, you notice you're being dragged into a battlefield that isn't yours, and one where you're already losing. This is the unconscious manipulator. A person unaware of their own wounds, projecting them outward as a form of psychic survival. Jung once said, what we do not confront in ourselves, we will encounter as fate. And often that fate has a name, a face, and shares your table. The unconscious manipulator is dominated by repressed content, unresolved traumas, emotional fragments they have never dared to hold. Instead of turning inward, they turn to you. And slowly, you become the canvas for their internal conflict. This kind of person lives in a state of chronic projection. According to Jung, projection is a natural function of the psyche, but if it goes unrecognized, it becomes corrosive. In The Ego and the Unconscious, he explains that projection causes psychic blindness, a kind of prison where we no longer see others as they are, but only as symbols of what hides in us. And when someone projects like this, they stop seeing you altogether. They don't see you. They see a lost, unclaimed part of themselves. And they react to that image as if it were real. These individuals often position themselves as victims. In their world, everything that goes wrong is always someone else's fault. When they feel anger, it's because you provoked it. When they feel sadness, it's because you failed them. When they feel small, it's because you made them feel inferior. And the distortion is so subtle, so skillful, that soon you begin to ask yourself, was I truly insensitive? Did I say something wrong? Is it me? And that's how the manipulation unfolds. Not with shouts, not with commands. It's quiet, emotional, unconscious, and devastatingly effective. What makes it harder is that these people often appear magnetic. They're charismatic, emotionally intense, intuitive. They carry an energy that makes you feel seen until you realize you're only being used. You convince yourself you can help. You try to heal them. You believe you understand them better than others ever did. But what you're really doing is sacrificing your own psychic stability, trying to rescue someone who refuses to rescue themselves. And the more you try, the deeper you sink. Jung warns, this pattern of projection is dangerous because it places you into a role, not a real one, but a symbolic one. The savior, the enemy, the traitor, the parent, the chit, anything but your actual self. And living in that symbolic bond means living in an illusion. You are no longer seen as a person. You are treated as a reflection of someone else's unconscious. The only way to protect yourself from an unconscious manipulator is awareness, to see the pattern, to cut the invisible threads tying you to their emotional narrative, and above all, to ask yourself again and again, is what I'm feeling actually mine, or has it been placed in me? Because the unconscious manipulator does not barge into your life. They slip through the doorway of your empathy, and once you recognize this pattern, you must go one step further to understand how it evolves, how it disguises itself even more dangerously with the mask of the persona. Not just someone who projects, but someone who performs, the one who doesn't simply carry unprocessed wounds, but who builds an identity around hiding them. Because while the unconscious manipulator throws their pain onto you, the bearer of the persona will invite you into a world so convincing, you might forget who you really are. And not all psychological danger comes from extreme behaviors. It comes from what seems too perfect, from the ever-ready smile, from the impeccable posture, from the flawless image held so tightly, it feels brittle. We live in an era of appearances, where being matters less than seeming. But who pays the price when seeming becomes the only truth? For Jung, this was not a superficial concern. It was a deep and serious problem. Because when someone identifies too strongly with their persona, the social mask we wear to adapt to the world, they risk severing the connection to their true essence entirely. And those who live for the mask don't just lose themselves. They begin to distort everyone around them. In The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung wrote that the persona is what someone is not, but what he and others think he is. In other words, it is a carefully assembled illusion, shaped by social, familial, and professional expectations. And on its own, the persona isn't wrong. We all use it. It helps us navigate roles: doctor, teacher, sibling, friend. But the problem begins when someone believes they are only that. When the mask fuses to the skin, when everything spontaneous, vulnerable, and authentic is locked away in the basement of the psyche, the bearer of the persona becomes a master of functional superficiality. They say what others want to hear. They move correctly through every space. They avoid conflict like it's contamination. But behind that control lies a soul in slow collapse. Because the more they protect the image, the more they silence the self. And that silencing demands a price. For those who live or work with someone like this, the effect is haunting. You feel something is wrong, but you can't quite name it. There's a hollowness to every exchange. Nothing feels raw, nothing feels real. Every word seems rehearsed, and every pause seems timed. And soon, you find yourself rehearsing too. Because the bearer of the persona doesn't just mask themselves, they pressure you to do the same. They expect you to perform, to belong, to stay in character. And when you don't, when you cry, when you question, when you show something raw, they flinch, withdraw, shut down. Because anything unscripted reminds them of what they've buried, and they cannot bear to see it mirrored. Jung warned that this over-identification with the persona is one of the gravest threats to individuation. The process of becoming whole, integrating all parts of the self. The real danger begins, he said, when someone becomes hypnotized by the role they play and starts to believe that's all they are. And when that happens, when a person lives only to be admired, approved, accepted, they become a hostage to their own illusion. Everything real in them begins to die behind the glass. And if you've ever lived close to someone like this, you may have noticed something in yourself too. You begin to second-guess your own spontaneity. You start measuring your words, hiding your doubts, editing your truths. And without even realizing it, you begin to wear a mask of your own. Coexisting with a bearer of the persona is not just artificial. It is contagious. It shapes you, and slowly it replaces the air in the room. Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt you couldn't be fully yourself, even when nothing was said out loud? Share your story below. Sometimes a single comment speaks what someone else couldn't put into words. But even beyond this surface-level performance lies something more dangerous. Because when someone represses what they feel, think, and desire for too long, it doesn't disappear. It gathers weight, it ferments, and it builds pressure in the unconscious until it erupts. And now we step into darker ground, the world of the repressed shadow, the one who refuses to see their own darkness until it takes over. There is a type of person who is always measured, always restrained, always polite, always nice. But behind that polished exterior is a storm waiting for release. Because everything they've labeled wrong, ugly, or unacceptable hasn't been healed. It's only been buried, pushed into the basement of the soul. It hasn't been overcome. It hasn't been transformed. It's simply been repressed. This is the essence of the one who carries the repressed shadow. The person who tries to be light all the time until the dark begins to speak for them. Carljung devoted much of his life to this idea. In Aeon, he wrote, "The shadow is everything that the individual refuses to recognize in themselves and yet insists on manifesting in some way." We are not talking about something external. The shadow is not the evil of the world. It is not the other. It is not the enemy. The shadow is internal. It is the hatred you do not admit to feeling. It is the envy you explain away. It is the sexuality you silence. It is the ambition you hide beneath false humility. And it's the rage you label as just tired. Everything you reject in yourself does not vanish. It transforms into shadow. As Jung taught, what you do not make conscious directs your life, and you call it destiny. The owner of the repressed shadow rarely appears dangerous at first. In fact, they're often admired, disciplined, generous, responsible, even seed. But there's something just beneath the surface. They cannot tolerate weakness in others. They flinch at vulnerability. They stiffen in the face of strong emotion. They're always tightly controlled, but never fully calm, until the moment they explode. And when they do, the damage is deep. This person lives in constant emotional self-surveillance. They don't allow themselves to feel, and so they judge those who do. They can't forgive themselves for error, and so they attack those who err. They become moralistic, rigid, passive-aggressive, controlling, but all of that is just scaffolding built to hold the unconscious in place. Jung warned, the stronger the persona, the more repressed the shadow. And the more repressed the shadow, the more violent its return. You'll notice it in those who overreact to small things, who hold grudges for years, who sabotage relationships without understanding why. They are the infamous, difficult people no one seems to understand. So bitter, so reactive, so quietly hostile. The answer lies in the shadow, unintegrated, unspoken, and unhealed. And here's what most overlook. The shadow isn't just made of what's bad. Jung made it clear it contains your rejected potential, your muted creativity, your unclaimed strength, the parts of you that were told to be quiet when you were still too young to understand why. But when these parts are ignored, even the brightest ones turn toxic, and that poison begins to seep into relationships, into the air of a room, into the minds of those closest. Living near someone who carries a repressed shadow is like walking through a minefield. You can't see what will trigger them. But the moment you step wrong, everything detonates, and often you are left cleaning up what their psyche refused to own. And yet, this repression doesn't arise in a vacuum. It is often fed by a fantasy, the illusion of superiority, the need to be good, a rigid ideal of virtue that turns guilt into a form of control. Have you ever felt like someone used morality to make you feel small without ever raising their voice? If you've been there, say it below. You're not alone in that silence. From this soil, another archetype grows, the moral controller. Someone who not only represses their own desires, but turns your joy, your spontaneity, your freedom into something shameful. They don't raise weapons. They use rules, dogma, correctness. Phrases that sound noble but sting like judgment. They claim their actions are guided by ethics, righteousness, higher values. But in truth, they are building a cage, one of guilt, of shame, of silent superiority, and then locking you inside it with them. Jung knew this pattern well. When morality is used as facade, he said, it becomes one of the most insidious forms of psychic repression. Because instead of integrating their own shadow, the moral controller projects it outward, onto the lives, desires, and instincts of others, and they condemn what they secretly carry. You have certainly met someone like this, people who frequently point fingers, but never look inward. They place themselves as the standard of behavior, not because they truly embody it, but because they desperately need to uphold the image of moral superiority. The appearance of virtue becomes more important than the truth of their inner world. According to Jung, the more intense the repression, the greater the pressure to project the shadow. And that is exactly what the moral controller does. They turn others into sinners, deviants, immoral beings, not out of awareness, but to escape the discomfort of facing their own contradictions, their own impulses, their own denied desires. What makes this pattern so insidious is that unlike the common manipulator, the moral controller genuinely believes they are doing good. They think they are saving, correcting, enlightening. And it is precisely this conviction that makes their influence so difficult to detect, because it wears the costume of care, of authority, of righteousness. Their criticisms are wrapped in well-worn phrases. This is for your own good, you'll understand one day. Or, someone had to tell you the truth. But this truth isn't pure. It's not neutral. It's saturated with projection, dripping with unconscious fear, guilt, and denial. In Eon, Jung writes about the figures of Christ and the Antichrist, not as religious labels, but as psychological archetypes. One represents wholeness, the integration of opposites. The other represents dissociation, the refusal to acknowledge the dark. The moral controller believes they are living as the light, but in doing so, they deny their own shadow. And that denial leads to blindness, to spiritual arrogance, to emotional harm. They project what is unbearable inside themselves onto others. And in doing so, they preserve the illusion of purity at the cost of human complexity, the cost of connection. If you live close to someone like this, the experience is corrosive. Over time, you begin to feel guilty simply for being yourself. Guilty for having wants, for feeling joy, for choosing freedom. It's as though your existence is always being judged by an invisible standard you never agreed to. And slowly, you start to shrink to fit it. What's most disturbing is how easily this judgment becomes internalized. You start to repress what is natural in you. Your instincts, your spontaneity, your voice. You bend toward an ideal that is not your own. The morality of the other becomes a prison, and the door is often left open. So you forget it's even there. This dynamic is common in families, in religious structures, and in rigid institutions where obedience is mistaken for virtue. Jung saw it as a serious threat to individuation, the process of becoming whole. Because where there is moralism without depth, there is usually an absence of self-knowledge. The extreme moralist isn't searching for truth. They're searching for control. And when they cannot control the world around them, they turn inward, trying to control the minds and hearts of those beside them. But the moral controller is not the only one shaped by unconscious forces. There is another figure, one even more volatile, unpredictable, and unstable, the complexed individual. While the moralist represses and projects, the complex person is no longer holding the unconscious at bay. Instead, they are governed by it, overtaken by it. They react not from clarity, but from wounds, from memories, from unresolved pain. Consciousness is still present, but it is no longer in charge. Imagine being close to someone who one moment is affectionate, generous, and soft, and the next is distant, furious, or accusing. A compliment becomes an obligation. A joke is taken as an insult. A gesture of care is seen as a threat. No matter what you do, the ground beneath you constantly shifts. This is the experience of living beside someone governed by unconscious complexes. For Jung, complexes are autonomous emotional cores, clusters of memory and feeling that dwell in the unconscious and can take control of consciousness at any moment. They are like fragmented personalities within us, created by trauma, psychic wounds, and experiences left unresolved. In Psychological Types and the Ego and the Unconscious, Jung describes how these complexes interfere with behavior in ways most people never realize. You think you're reacting to the present, but you're reacting to echoes of something long buried. A simple comment triggers a forgotten rejection. A look touches the bruise of an old abandonment. And those closest to you often pay the price. The complex person doesn't know they're being led by internal forces. When they lash out in fury, spiral into sadness, or seethe with resentment, they believe they're being reasonable. But they're not. They are re-experiencing what was never digested emotionally. And what makes it more confusing is how inconsistent it is. There are moments of peace, even warmth. Then the rupture, the storm, the accusation, the silence, and those brief moments of genuine connection, they are what keep you holding on. You tell yourself, they're not always like this, because sometimes they're wonderful. Sometimes you see the person they could be, but what follows is a crash so confusing that you begin to reshape yourself to prevent it. You walk on eggshells, you avoid certain topics, you shrink, and still, the storm comes. Here is the brutal truth. You are not the one who awakens the monster. It was always there, latent, hungry, waiting for a reason, and when it emerges, it devours everything. Jung warned that unintegrated complexes can colonize the psyche. They think for you, speak for you, act for you. And in the complex person, this happens often. They may be controlled by a martyr complex, an inferiority complex, an abandonment complex, each one with its own emotional gravity. And the more you try to keep peace, the more you're consumed by a cycle that was never yours to begin with. Being close to someone like this means living in constant alert. Nothing is ever stable. The present is always haunted. And eventually their ghosts begin to enter you. You begin to doubt your memory, your feelings, your truth. And without even knowing it, you too are being colonized by someone else's unconscious. But even more dangerous than this chaos is what comes next. Because while the complex person explodes, the next type doesn't shout, doesn't fight, doesn't even speak loudly. Instead, they consume you quietly. This is the psychic vampire. They do not drain you with cruelty, but with dependency, with need, with sadness wrapped in sweetness, with stories that require your sympathy every hour of every day. They don't want your presence, they want your energy, and they will do whatever it takes to feed on it. For Jung, this wasn't a myth. It was a symbol of unresolved symbiosis, a bond where boundaries dissolve, where two psyches blur, and where one person becomes the emotional fuel for another. The psychic vampire lives in this bond. They need your attention, your comfort, your constant presence. And behind that need, a void that is not yours to fill. You give support, then time, then your energy, then you give yourself, until you're left exhausted, hollowed, unsure where you end and they begin. This exhaustion isn't just physical, it is existential. It is the slow erosion of the self. Drop by drop, Jung described people who cannot stand on their own as emotional parasites. Those who, instead of growing, seek to be carried. And the real danger? It's not only in the drain. It's in the distortion, the reversal. They make you feel guilty for needing rest, selfish for needing space, cold for needing silence. They reverse roles until you're the one apologizing for trying to survive. But the way out exists. Jung gave us a path to bring the unconscious into consciousness, not just to analyze others, but to look within. Because maybe, at some point, you were also a bearer of the persona, or someone ruled by a complex. Maybe you needed more than others could give. None of us are exempt. We all carry pain, we all carry shadow. The difference is this: who dares to see it, and who continues to project it. This was a mirror, a deep reflection into the forces that tie us, hurt us, define us. And if you've made it here, you're ready. Ready to name what was unnamed, ready to step out of being hostage, ready to reclaim your sovereignty. Drop a comment below. I choose my clarity. It's a quiet phrase, but it speaks volumes. And if this journey moves something in you, like it, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to stay close. The next video will take you deeper, because the more light we shed on the unconscious, the less it controls us. Thank you for being here. We'll meet again, within.